In the heart of a vast and mysterious land, where the mountains stood tall and ancient trees whispered secrets of the past, there was a village untouched by time. Life moved in simple rhythms here, with the sun rising over the fields and setting behind the hills. The village's people lived modestly, relying on their hands and the earth for sustenance. Among these villagers was Tom, a man unlike the others, driven not by the contentment of a quiet life, but by an insatiable hunger for something more. Tom had spent years combing through tales of distant lands, of hidden riches buried deep within forgotten places. The legends of lost treasures were his obsession. His eyes gleamed whenever he heard whispers of gold and jewels hidden beneath the earth. And no story intrigued him more than the one told about the Cave of Fool's Gold, a place said to hold riches beyond imagination, but cursed to bring ruin to those who dared to seek it. For years, Tom had avoided the cave, dismissing it as a mere tale to scare off the greedy. But now, as the weight of years of fruitless searching pressed down on him, he found himself drawn to it. One evening, as the sky turned red and the air hung thick with the approaching night, Tom ventured into the village square, where the old man sat by a small fire, staring into the flames with eyes that seemed to know too much. "Tell me about the cave," Tom demanded, his voice barely hiding his eagerness. The old man didn't look up but chuckled, his laugh dry and cold. "You are a fool if you think that cave holds anything for you but death," he said, his voice a soft rasp against the crackling fire. "Many have gone there, driven by greed, and none have returned. The cave's treasures are not for the living." Tom's face hardened. He had heard enough warnings in his life to know they were often nothing more than the ramblings of the fearful. "You can keep your warnings," he replied sharply. "I know what I'm looking for, and nothing will stop me." At that, the old man raised his eyes, and they glinted in the firelight. "There is a price for everything, treasure hunter," he said. "You may not believe in curses, but you will believe in loss." Tom turned away, his heart set. He would not let an old man's warnings deter him. Armed with his tools and driven by a hunger for riches, Tom set out the next morning toward the cave. The path leading there was long and treacherous, winding through dense forests and steep rocky cliffs. As he neared the cave's entrance, the air seemed to grow colder, and a heavy stillness settled over the land, as if the earth itself held its breath. The entrance to the cave was wide and dark, a yawning mouth in the side of the mountain, beckoning him inside. Tom hesitated for only a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows before stepping forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and something older, something that spoke of time forgotten. Tom lit a torch and moved deeper into the cave. The walls glittered faintly, veins of minerals sparkling like stars in the darkness. His heart raced as he imagined the riches waiting for him just ahead. But as he ventured further, the cave seemed to close in around him, the passageways twisting and turning, leading him deeper into the mountain's heart. It was then that the first trap sprung. A sharp crack echoed through the cave, and the ground beneath Tom gave way, sending him tumbling down into a pit. He landed hard, his torch sputtering out in the fall. Pain shot through his body, but when he opened his eyes, the faint glow of gold met his gaze. There, piled in the center of the pit, were mounds of gold coins, jewels, and treasures beyond his wildest dreams. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had found it. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his limbs as he rushed toward the pile of treasure. His hands reached out, eager to grasp the fortune that lay before him. But the moment his fingers touched the gold, a terrible chill ran through him. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was the old man, but something was different. His face was hollow, his eyes empty, and his voice, when it came, was a whisper that echoed off the cave walls. "You were warned," the old man said, his voice filled with sorrow. "This treasure was never meant for you." Tom's mind raced as he stared at the old man, who seemed more like a shadow than flesh now, standing between him and the treasure. The cave, once quiet, was now alive with sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the faint echo of footsteps that weren't his own. His heart pounded as he stepped back, his eyes flicking between the gold before him and the old man, who remained But the weight of the old man's words hung in the air like a stone round his neck. Tom tried to shake the feeling off, to focus on the treasure at his feet. Surely, this was what he had come for, what he had sacrificed so much for. All the years of searching, the countless failures, and the whispers of others mocking him for chasing fantasies, they had led him here, to this moment. He bent down, scooping a handful of gold coins into his hands. Their cold weight felt real enough, but as he stared at them, something changed. The coins, which moments ago had beamed with promise, now seemed dull, lifeless. His hands trembled as the treasure he had longed for began to crumble in his grip, turning to dust and slipping through his fingers. "No," Tom cried, dropping to his knees, frantically trying to gather the gold, but it was too late. The entire pile had disintegrated before his eyes, leaving nothing but a thin layer of ash in its place. His hands dug through the remains, desperate to find even a single piece of gold that hadn't turned to dust, but it was all gone. From behind him, the old man's voice came again, low and mournful. "The treasure is an illusion, just like your greed. You should have turned back when you had the chance." Tom's head whipped around, his face twisted in frustration and fear. "What is this place?" he shouted. "What have you done to me?" The old man did not respond immediately. He simply stared at Tom, his expression unchanged, as if he had seen this unfold 100 times before. Finally, he spoke. "This cave was never meant to bring wealth to the living. It was built to test the hearts of those who seek riches without regard for the cost. You, like many before you, have failed that test." Tom's hands clenched into fists, anger flaring up inside him. "You're lying. I've worked for this, sacrificed everything for this treasure. It's mine." He lunged forward, his hands outstretched toward the old man, but before he could reach him, the cave shifted again. The ground beneath Tom trembled violently, and the walls seemed to close in, the once spacious cave now narrowing, squeezing him from all sides. Tom stumbled backward, his balance lost as the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing another dark chasm below. With a cry, he fell again, this time into a deeper part of the cave. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Gasping for air, Tom lay there for a moment, pain shooting through his body. His torch had been lost in the fall, and now he was plunged into complete darkness. For a moment, all was still. The only sound was Tom's ragged breathing as he tried to push himself up, every muscle in his body aching. Then, out of the darkness, came a low guttural sound, like the growl of some ancient creature that had long slept in the belly of the earth. Tom froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The growling grew louder, closer, and then he heard it, the sound of something large moving through the shadows, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled to his feet, desperately feeling his way through the darkness, trying to find an escape. But there was no light, no way out. The walls around him seemed to shift and change with every step, the passageways leading him in circles. He could feel the presence of whatever was following him, its breath hot on the back of his neck, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing but darkness. His mind raced, his thoughts fragmented as the reality of his situation began to set in. He was trapped in a cave that played tricks on his senses, trapped in a nightmare where every step led him deeper into madness. Desperation clawed at his mind. He shouted into the void, his voice hoarse and frantic. "Help me! Somebody help me!" But there was no answer, only the sound of his voice echoing back to him, swallowed by the darkness. And then, just when he thought he could go no further, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small, barely more than a flicker, but it was enough to give him hope. He ran toward it, his feet slipping on the uneven ground, his body screaming in protest with every step. As he neared the light, he saw that it came from the entrance to another chamber, one that was larger than the others he had passed through. The light flickered from a single torch mounted on the far wall, casting long shadows across the room. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made Tom's blood run cold. There, surrounded by a ring of ancient stones, was a pile of bones, human bones, scattered and broken, as if the remains of those who had come before him and met the same fate. Tom's breath caught in his throat, The reality of what this place was, what it had always been, hit him with full force. The treasure had never been real. It had been a lure, a trap designed to ensnare those greedy enough to chase after it. And now, Tom realized he was no different from those whose bones lay before him. Tom stood frozen, his eyes locked on the pile of bones in front of him. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. All the warnings, the tales he had dismissed as superstition, now felt painfully real. He was not the first to come here, lured by the promise of riches, and he would not be the last to fall victim to the cave's curse. The silence of the chamber was thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint crackling of the torch in the corner. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing as he tried to find a way out, a way to escape the fate that had claimed so many before him. But the cave had other plans. As Tom took a step back from the bones, the ground beneath him began to shift once again. The stones around the chamber trembled, and a deep rumbling sound filled the air. The walls seemed to move, closing in on him, and the shadows cast by the torch grew longer and more twisted, like dark fingers reaching out to pull him into the abyss. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, stumbling backward, his mind spinning in confusion and terror. He turned to flee, but the passageway he had come through was gone, sealed off by the shifting stone. He was trapped, the cave closing around him like a living, breathing thing, intent on keeping him there forever. Tom's vision blurred as panic took hold of him. He felt the cold air pressing against his skin, and the sound of his own heartbeat echoed in his ears. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was losing his mind, if this place had finally driven him to madness, like it had so many others. But then, from deep within the chamber, another sound emerged, cutting through the chaos like a blade. It was a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably real. "Tom," the voice whispered, sending a shiver down his spine. "You cannot escape." Tom whipped around, searching the room for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Only the flickering shadows and the cold dead bones scattered across the floor. But the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Tom, you have already sealed your fate." His heart pounded harder, his mind grasping for any sense of control. "Who's there?" He shouted into the darkness, his voice raw with fear. "Show yourself." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the shadows in the room began to shift and coalesce, forming a figure that Tom recognized instantly. It was the old man, but now he was different. His body seemed to melt into the darkness around him, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He stood tall and menacing, a twisted version of the man Tom had seen by the fire, his voice now cold and hollow. "You were warned, treasure hunter," the old man said, his words echoing off the stone walls. "But you did not listen." Tom backed away, his legs trembling beneath him. "I don't understand," he cried. I thought the treasure was real." The old man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "The treasure is real, Tom. But it is not yours to take. It was never meant for the living." Tom's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The old man stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the room. "This place is a tomb, a prison for the souls of those who, like you, sought to claim what was never theirs. The gold, the jewels, the wealth, they were all illusions, crafted to lure the greedy and the foolish into the darkness. And now, you are one of them." Tom's mind reeled as the old man's words sank in. He had been chasing a fantasy, a lie, and now he was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The weight of his mistake crushed him, and for the first time since entering the cave, he felt the cold sting of regret. "There must be a way out," Tom pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll leave. I'll give it all up. Just let me go." But the old man shook his head, his glowing eyes filled with pity. "There is no escape, Tom. The moment you set foot in this cave, your fate was sealed." Tom collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He had come so far, sacrificed so much, and for what? A lie, a curse that had claimed the lives of countless others before him. And now, he was doomed to share their fate. As he knelt there, broken and defeated. The shadows in the room began to swell around him, closing in like a shroud. The old man's voice echoed in his ears, a final warning before the darkness consumed him. You were given a choice, Tom, and now you will pay the price. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Tom's body felt heavy, his mind slipping into a fog as the cave claimed him. His last thought before the darkness took him was of the old man's words, of the warning he had ignored in his greed and arrogance. And then, there was nothing. Tom's story, like so many before him, would become yet another whispered tale, a cautionary legend told by the fireside to warn others of the dangers of greed and the cursed cave that waited for those foolish enough to seek its riches. The cave of fool's gold remained, its dark heart pulsing with the souls of those who had tried and failed to escape its grip. And somewhere deep within its twisting passageways, the old man waited for the next fool to come seeking fortune, knowing that the cave would never be empty for long. Tom was gone, consumed by the very darkness he had sought to conquer. His name, like so many before him, would fade into the winds that swept through the village, a mere whisper, a cautionary tale for those who might be tempted by greed. But the cave remained, silent and still, waiting for its next victim. Days passed, and in the village, rumors began to spread. Tom had not returned, and those who knew of his quest to the cursed cave spoke in hushed tones. Some believed he had found the treasure and disappeared to live a life of luxury far from their modest homes. Others knew the truth. He had become yet another victim of the cave's insidious grip. The old man, guardian of the cave and its secrets, continued his silent vigil by the fire, watching as time passed and the world outside the cave moved on. He had seen countless treasure hunters like Tom come and go, each driven by the same insatiable hunger for wealth, and each had met the same fate, swallowed by the darkness that lay within the cave's depths. The villagers, though aware of the dangers, could not resist the lure of the tale. The idea of untold riches hidden just beyond their reach, guarded only by superstition, was too tempting to ignore. They spoke of Tom as they had spoken of others before him, and though they knew the risks, there were always those who believed they could be the exception. Months passed, and another man, younger and more ambitious than Tom, came to the village. He had heard the stories of the cave and the treasure it held, and like Tom, he was not deterred by the warnings. He sought out the old man, finding him by the same fire where Tom had stood, eager for the same knowledge. "Tell me about the cave," the young man demanded, his voice filled with the same eagerness that had once filled Tom's. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the young man's with the same sad knowing that had greeted Tom. "You are a fool if you think the cave holds anything for you but death," the old man said, his voice soft but firm. "Many have gone there, driven by greed, and none have returned." The young man laughed, dismissing the old man's words as the ramblings of someone too old to understand ambition. "I am not like them," he said confidently. "I will find the treasure. I am smarter, faster, stronger. I will succeed where they failed." The old man's face remained impassive. He had heard these words before, from men just like this one. "There is a price for everything," the old man said quietly. "The cave takes much more than it gives." But the young man, like Tom, was determined. He turned away from the old man, his eyes set on the distant mountains where the cave lay hidden. Without another word, he began his journey, his heart filled with the promise of wealth and fortune. The old man watched him go, a heavy sigh escaping his lips as the flames of his fire flickered in the cool evening air. He knew what would happen next. He always knew. The young man made his way to the cave, following the same path Tom had taken months before. The journey was treacherous, the terrain unforgiving, but he pressed on, driven by the vision of gold and jewels that awaited him. By the time he reached the cave's entrance, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The cave loomed before him, dark and silent, its entrance like the open mouth of some ancient beast waiting to devour him whole. But the young man was undeterred. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The air grew cold as he ventured deeper into the cave, and soon he found himself lost in the same twisting passageways that had ensnared Tom. The walls seemed to move, shifting and changing with every step, leading him in circles until he could no longer tell which way he had come. Panic began to set in, but the young man pushed it aside. He would not be afraid. He would not fail. But the cave had other plans. Just as it had with Tom, the cave began to show its true nature. The illusions of treasure appeared before him, piles of gold and jewels glinting in the dim light of his torch. His heart raced with excitement as he reached out to claim the wealth he had sought. But the moment his fingers touched the treasure, it crumbled to dust. A cold wind swept through the cave, and the young man heard the same voice that had haunted Tom in his final moments. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, sending chills down his spine. The young man spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but he was alone, or so he thought. From the shadows, the old man's figure emerged, just as it had for Tom, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You were warned," the old man said softly, "but you did not listen." The young man's heart pounded in his chest, fear gripping him as the walls of the cave seemed to close in around him. "This isn't real," he muttered, backing away from the old man. "It can't be real." But the old man stepped forward, his presence growing larger, more imposing. "It is real," he said, his voice filling the chamber. "And now you, like all the others, will pay the price for your greed." The young man's scream echoed through the cave, but no one outside would ever hear it. The cave had claimed another soul, and so it would continue, as it always had. The legend of the Fool's Gold Cave would live on, drawing in the greedy and the foolish, each believing they could be the one to escape its curse. But none would. The cave's hunger was endless, and the old man, its eternal guardian, would always be there waiting. Tom's story was only one of many. His name would fade, but the cave remained. A warning, a tomb, a place where dreams of wealth turned into nightmares. And as long as there were those willing to risk everything for gold, the cave would never be empty. This final part wraps up the story with a cyclical ending, where the cave's curse continues, and the next fool is already in line to meet the same fate. The story leaves a lasting impression, a warning against greed, and ends on a reflective and eerie note, making it clear that the legend will never die.